Hello, you're listening to the Saluki Gamescast. This is episode 74 for Friday, March 1st, 2024. Just the day after Leap Day. Yay. My name is Justin Young. Joining me, as usual, are Christina Ivey and Mario Sanders. Alicia is out this week. She's going to some talking parrot exhibit, is my understanding. She'll appreciate that.
Close.
So we have a special guest, Kevin Mercer, who is a faculty member in the College of Arts and Media, and particularly in the radio and television.
That's right.
It's still called that technically for now?
Yes, for this moment, yes.
You're like everyone on this campus, like, I think so.
Yeah, none of us know how to answer questions like that, on a day-to-day basis. But for now, yeah, radio, television, and digital media.
Okay, yeah. So, Kevin, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you teach over in radio, television, digital media?
Yeah, very good. So I'm assistant professor of digital media arts and animation. So I teach animation courses ranging from introductory to advanced or special topics, and also game development courses. Most recently, a series of courses called Saluki X, which is meant to sort of poke fun at SpaceX. So if we built a series of video games that allowed us to travel space in ways that are ethical, might that be a better outcome, right? So academically, let's go visit a planet, even a fictional one, and model behaviors we'd like to see in the future that aren't just based on, capitalist endeavors. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm focused on now as far as teaching.
And this semester, we should say, the Saluki X class is building a game centered around the solar eclipse that's coming in April, first
That's
week
right.
of April.
Yeah, April 8th. So
Yeah.
we're on a race against the eclipse, against the the celestial bodies to finish a video game by
Feels very
April
Zelda-y. I don't know.
Yeah, it's Majora's Mask.
Yeah.
yeah, lunar timeline. So it's very exciting.
Nice.
So I'm actually taking that class this semester. So
that's so cool.
Last night was building assets for our game.
Good.
So
I'm glad to hear it.
I feel like that's become like when I have free time, I'm setting at my computer. Like, how do I make pixel bench seats? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. Welcome to game development. That's what we all lay in bed thinking about: is how do you make this look like that? And make it look good, right?
Right.
So that's great.
I feel I'm playing Alicia this time, and I'm writing down potential titles. Pixel bitch seat.
Well, I know, like, one of the challenges, like, one of the things that's been really interesting, like, from my perspective with it is just figuring out, like, well, how's this all going to come together, right? When you have all this, like, large team of people working on different elements, and we're kind of broken down into smaller teams to develop particular levels. But, like, you're talking to somebody and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go work on this. I'm going to go work on this. And then you come back and you're like, okay, how does this fit together? And then, like, what are we still missing? Like, what's going to tie this together? And so I feel like, particularly my group, I can speak for, that's been a really, like, interesting experience. But my, observation of other groups is that they've been also having that really interesting experience. And so it's going to be interesting to look at the levels and how distinct they feel for different groups, because everybody's kind of bringing a different style to it and everything.
That's cool.
Right.
Yeah.
So that'll be a really cool project. That's going to be posted for free on the SIU website.
That's right. Well, that's the hope. Yeah, we're hoping to get it onto one of either the SIU website or an Eclipse-specific website, as well as itch, right? So it will be available for free and playable online in browser. And probably a brief experience, maybe a 10 or 15-minute long game, but it takes a semester to make a 10 or 15-minute long game, so it turns out. So, available for all.
That's really interesting, because it's like making a short film. And, college students come in, they're like, well, I'm going to make a 2-hour movie. And you're like, no.
Right.
Shoot for like 10 minutes.
Right.
And, I think the same thing. People want to make the next Grand Theft Auto. And you're like, no, make a 10-minute experience.
Make a mini Theft Auto.
Mini Theft Auto. A Microvania. And,
there you go.
Yeah. Can't be open world on your first go. Certainly.
And then you also do research on video games and present at conferences and publish.
Yeah. So, and it's kind of, I work in a lot of different ways, right? I make installation art and experimental animations, but I do build video games and I study other games. So I'm in the process of adding an expansion to a game that I've already built that's complete. It's a first-person narrative puzzle game, and I'm building a game within that one. So it's sort of this frame story that is told through 2 different video games, where you're playing a 2-dimensional game inside of a 3-dimensional game that's saying something about each other. Those 2 games are communicating in certain ways. But then I also write and present on things like socio-spatial economies in video games. So I'm interested in Death Stranding, Dark Souls, games like that facilitate asynchronous cooperation, right? Emergent communities around spatial problems. Virtual spatial problems, I should say.
And I know you mentioned Super Mario Brothers Wonder as an example of that.
Yeah, the most recent Souls-like, if we could call it that. I guess not, probably. But it has some of the asynchronous stuff, right?
Right.
The standees, being able to sort of communicate or pathfind together, whether or not we're actually playing at the same time. I think it's pretty interesting.
All right. Well, cool. We are glad to have you. And real quick, what sort of games do you play? I mean, sounds like you're into the Souls games.
I am, yeah, and not in the toxic get good ways. I'm a kind and collegial,
Not a sweaty one.
Souls-like player. I do like Souls-likes. Yeah, I'm always ready to try new ones, particularly ones that have some sort of new gameplay mechanic that they weave in.
Did you play Liza P?
The demo, I've not, I've got really unhealthy gaming habits where I'm in and out of all of these different games, and then I come back and then I pursue one more fully. So I played the demo of Liza P, but that's as far as I've been.
Okay.
But it's beautiful and wonderful.
All right. Welcome. We're happy to have you,
thank you.
join us and everything.
Thank you.
And it's always exciting to bring somebody new in who can, offer a unique perspective. And so the rest of us, I know it's getting to be that time of the semester. We can actually say that for Alicia since she's not here, as we head towards midterms. And of course, Mario, you weren't here last week because you were at a conference talking about video games.
Yeah. So last week I presented at the Southwest. I never know what
It
the
has
acronym
such a
is.
long
Southwest
title.
Popular American Culture in their game studies area. I've presented there a handful of times now. And it went really well. This year I revisited my master's thesis. So my master's thesis was an ethnography of the God of War fan community, specifically the subreddit, in how they used their gameplay experiences and their understanding of the franchises, like the overarching narrative of the franchise, to make sense of masculinity and fatherhood. And so I was revisiting it just over the past year. My dad died, and so just some new thoughts and thinking about some of those things differently, because there's one scene in particular in the game that really resonated in sort of this, reflection that resonated in how I felt it like mirrored or paralleled one of the last calls that I had with my dad. So I presented on that. I don't, this isn't like a revision. I don't think differently of my original thesis or think that what I said back then is necessarily wrong, but just...
It's okay if you do.
I really don't, but it's just a new sort of layer of nuance. I still think there are really problematic things that the ways that the community think of, like masculinity and fatherhood. But I think that, like I said, there's just a new perspective based on this last year. But yeah, it was really good. Some very kind feedback. And I will say, one of really just like validating of the sort of work in and of itself. There was a scholar there from, I don't know, some school in Minnesota, and he brought his stepson with him. His stepson is 15, and he said, is just really into video games, likes watching people play them, likes talking about them, likes playing them. And so he's like, and so I thought, bring him to the conference and, he might enjoy some of the talks, think that they're interesting. And after my talk, the 15-year-old came up to me and was just like, oh, that was really cool. I really enjoyed your talk. And he said, my dad died a couple of years ago, and I just really appreciated it. Really, like I said, he said a few times that it was really cool. Now, it might be the first time ever that like openly crying in front of a room of people was really cool. But yeah, so I just appreciated that. And the next day, the stepdad sort of came up to me and talked about it a little bit more, just saying that how his stepson kind of like after his biological father passed, kind of isolated himself and coped through a lot of his gameplay. And, just from the talk, he said he felt like he saw his like sort of stepson light up a little bit, started like thinking about it and talking about it and just being a little bit more open. And so, I just feel like, I don't know if there's a better sort of compliment or validation of that work than that. So, it was a really good conference. It was energizing just in like the other panels that I got to listen to. Some of them were really cool in terms of how they like gave me some ideas for the work that I want to do moving forward. A couple of the papers are things that I'm working on this semester. It was really good.
That's great. I mean, that's fantastic. That's always the hope when you go to a conference, that it'll actually stimulate something in yourself, right? Like that you come home with ideas from it. And it's not always the case. I mean, there's conferences sometimes you go to and you're like, what is going on here? So it's always fantastic when you have that connection. But like, I know you've got you've been to this conference multiple times.
It's a great conference.
You've built a pretty good experience through it.
Yeah, this is the third time I've presented. I was a little hesitant just because the first day of the conference, so last Wednesday was the 1-year anniversary of my dad's death. And so I was like, it might be just the timing of it was weird, but I think I gave myself permission to just not do anything. I didn't go to any of the panels. I didn't socialize. I walked to a diner and got dinner in the evening. And I think that was really good. I think it would have really drained me if I tried to do more engaging on that day in particular. And I think just in particular because I was at the airport getting ready to fly there last year when I found out. And so, driving back, I didn't go last year, even though I had planned on it and all of that. But it was just the timing of it was weird. And I think it was I'm glad that it was as good as it was. I think if it had been a more negative experience, it was it would have, I don't know if I would necessarily feel super confident going back or, I could see how it would be just feel a little tainted,
right.
Just by the timing of it, not by, anybody there or anything. But yeah, it was really nice. And it was good to see some people that, I've connected with over the few years. I feel like this year, one of the presenters, I've connected with them via email already afterwards. They've sent me their presentation and their reading list for the paper that I'm working on now. And they've been really supportive. And so it was a really, really good conference. I would put it up there as might be one of the better or best conferences I've been to in my academic career thus far.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, you talking about the timing, right?
Yeah.
Being able to have that positive experience, surrounding that date and everything, which is helpful.
Yeah.
As somebody who's gone through the same sort of situation as you, it does help.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I mean, it's also nice to hear, talking to other academics that game studies is something that's actually taken seriously.
I was just thinking that actually, yeah.
Because I'm thinking I started going to academic conferences almost 20 years ago at this point, and I remember going to them and video game stuff was first it often wasn't its own presentation. It was oh, you're talking about video games? We'll put you in the hodgepodge category over here. You're sort of talking about something. This is sort of film related, right? We'll put you with the film people, and you're oh, okay, I guess, sort of. And then you would go to it, and it just felt like nobody there knew anything about games and weren't interested in it. And so the audience just wasn't receptive. And I feel like that's shifted dramatically, where you see that much more at conferences now.
Which is crazy because, like, Mario, your story in and of itself shows the impact that games can have. Like the young guy that you were talking to at 15, like his father passing, him using games as a mechanism to cope, especially like in a society where men can't have emotions because, you know, you're not supposed to. And so, like, having that to cope through it, like, I don't think y'all's story is isolated. I think a lot of people do that. We talked on this podcast before about games like Spiritfarer and those other games that are not quote unquote fun, but are games that you can use to work through emotions. They're more experiences than what is fun. And I think that's a reason some academics turn their nose up, is they're like, oh, these are just for children, or oh, these are just for fun. They don't realize, one, how far video games have come since like Atari, right? And how much we can put into this particular medium.
Yeah, I mean, I love the game Gone Home. And I hear people like often dismiss that game.
Oh, I love that game.
Like there's nothing significant to it. It's a walking simulator. And I remember the first time I got to, well, before I even got there, like getting, say, 3/4 of the way through that game and going, oh, this is like doing something much more interesting than I realized. Because like I was kind of into all the nostalgia stuff, like finding the X-Files VHS tapes where you taped it off television and stuff, and being like, this is cool. Like games don't do this sort of stuff normally. And then you get about 3/4 of the way and you start to realize what the game is more doing. And then you get to the very end of it and you're like, oh, this like kind of packs an emotional wallop. Like if you've invested into the lives, into the like the nooks and crannies of this game, you start to like have this emotional experience playing it. That was from me as a heterosexual male. Like I can only imagine, right? Like what a young lesbian woman's reaction would be.
I cried at the end, I'm not gonna lie. As a young lesbian woman, I cried.
And that was my like feeling playing it, was like, oh, this would be even more of a wallop of how this is going to hit. I know that game Unpacking, I've talked about it before, but man, like you get to that game, and of course it doesn't explicitly call the parts of it out, but like you start finding little things and you're like, oh, that thing's not packed this time. And what does that mean? And like, what am I reading into this game that, why did you stop packing this item? Why did you leave this item behind and everything? And like, that would be if you played that game at the wrong time or the right time, I guess, depending on your perspective, that game would really have an emotional impact.
I think it's a testament to, especially with that game, just packing things or unpacking things rather. It's a testament to like the game's ability to suck you in, so to speak. It's like, are you paying attention to these little things? Are you realizing like, are building those emotional connections, so to speak? And I think that game it's kind of masterful in the way it does it. Like it's such a simple mechanic. It's definitely one of the anxiety games that I play. But for it to like connect on that very subtle level, I thought was just really ingenious.
And it says a lot about how we invest emotions into these inanimate objects, right? Which is something that games certainly play into, because so many games are collectathons, right? So you are investing into these, but games rarely stop and actually address that within the gameplay. And that's one where it does.
That's the one that I'm trying to think of, that's why I'm playing in my phone, is like trying to find what's the one where you're like, it's basically walking simulator. You're walking through a like wildlife forest refuge. You're the Firewatch. I kept searching for Firestarter and the movie came up, but oh man,
not Drew Barrymore.
Exactly. I was like, oh no. Firewatch was one of those for me as well. Like, it seemed simplistic. It followed a very good timeline, and then you get really connected to the voice of the other ranger. And I was just waiting to, like, I felt like the character, like, waiting to meet her. And so, I'm gonna have to go home and replay that one, actually.
So yeah, I mean, games maturing and seeing that reflected in academia and academia's sort of attitude towards it. I mean, so Kevin, you teaching a class in video game design, and like that's something, 20 years ago when I was an undergrad, there were no games, no classes on video games.
Right.
Like even in computer science, they weren't teaching game design classes.
For a long time, it was a really opaque process. Like, how do you even get into it? How do you get into making games? How are they even made? Such a huge mystery. So it is heartening to know that academically, critically, games are being taken more seriously. I think it will continue that way. I hope so. And I think they need to be studied more because, games are relatively young as a media. But they're moving faster than ever. Just technologically, the way they work, the way that developing them has become democratized. So anybody can start building a video game today and then go publish it online. I mean, that's really special. But I think that the speed at which all of this moves really begs examination of the medium. But I think it's really interesting, too, when you're talking about an experience at a conference, we expect or we hope, right, that we'll appeal to someone's intellect in a setting like that. But to know that what you presented sort of connected with somebody emotionally as well, I mean, that's pretty special.
Yeah, I guess, I remember the first year going, the very first night, we all walked to a place for dinner, and the area chair, just as we were walking, just sort of walked up to me and struck up a conversation, just like, how's it going? And blah. And I think that to me spoke of the community of this particular group, or this particular area at this particular conference. And that was something that he talked about a lot of there are people here who have been coming to this conference for 20 years now. We like to think of ourselves as very collaborative. People have collaborated on projects here before and, developed these bonds and these friendships. And I think that's why that one in particular feels special as well. I understand the idea of networking, I feel because of going to this conference and, establishing some of these bonds, even though I might not talk to any of them again until next year. I know when I see them, there's something there to immediately connect on. And I think I also just really appreciate this conference as compared to, well, I guess I can't say as compared to a communication studies conference because I've actually never been to a communication studies conference. But it just this, I feel this group, you kind of find your people type of thing in terms of academically. I really like that because game studies is kind of spread out across all these different fields. You get all these different perspectives on how to look at games, how to study games. There are people who, make games and game development, professors there as well, talking about the games that they're working on or what they're working on with their classes. And so you just get all of these different perspectives that are very cool as compared to, the more discipline-based conferences that I have been to, where it is more, I'm not going to say singularly perspective, a singular perspective, but that perspective is more aligned. I appreciate the multi-perspective that you get from more this topic-based conference where people from all different kinds of backgrounds are coming into it.
That's the key to navigating conferences, I think, as an academic, is finding that smaller one that's based on something that appeals to you in your academic identity. For me, it was the small little autoethnography conference that happens because there were people, I think, from at least 8 or 9 countries, the last time I went. And so it's you truly get that diverse perspective. But I love those little ones, where you feel like you find your people, so to speak.
And I haven't been to the Southwest Conference, but I've been to the National ACA PCA Conference multiple times. And I I understand entirely what you're saying with like it bringing together very divergent people, right? So that you have people from a literature background, from a film background, from a communication background, and a mass communication background, communication studies, and all these people are coming together into one room and kind of sharing like how they're approaching this particular subject, right? And I think you're absolutely right. You don't always get that at other conferences.
And I love how it's inevitable. You get the film person who's like studying games for the first time with this paper, and I appreciate like their openness of like, I have no idea what I'm doing here in terms of like, I don't have the background. And so like, and just that, like I said, that group's like willingness to like, oh, you should look into this, you should look into this, or you should look into this. And like I said, that was one of those things that area chair said that first time I met him, which like, I would much rather you bring like a half-baked idea that you have kind of all these different directions or all these different things that you don't really know what you're doing with than something that feels a lot more solid, like, is very much like and I know that that's what conferences are supposed to be, like the building of ideas and stuff like that. But I think hearing him say that and then hearing some of the more like senior or veteran people who have been there for 10, 15 years doing exactly that, opening up their talk with, so I'm still figuring this thing out. So I'm just going to talk for the next 10 minutes about my ideas, and then everybody sort of, pitching in and helping out. As just the other reason why, I really appreciate this particular group.
But when you talk about the person coming from film and saying, I don't really know what I'm talking about in this, I think that speaks heavily to there's not a game studies department.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm sure there are. I'm sure some schools have started that. But, like, we don't have that. So who are the people who are into game studies? Well, we have somebody from radio television. We have people from communication studies. We have people over in English. And those are, like, there's not a place for those people. So they are all having to kind of come together and figure it out, right? Like, where is the future of this discipline? Like you sometimes, if you go to a film conference, sometimes you have people from outside film, but nowadays most people are going to be involved in a film program or in at least, something similar to that, right?
Yeah.
That's actually something so Mario, I was at Boise State when Mario was at Boise State, and we were talking about where he was going to apply for a PhD program. And that was one of the things is like you had a hard time finding, you had found like one, right?
Yeah.
Program and it was more so the person rather than the program.
Yeah. There's like one person at the University of Oregon who in communication who did game studies.
I had suggested here because I was like, games, you have like, you can go to these places, you need like methodological grounding kind of thing, because it was a struggle to try to find places that where you would fit in basically.
Yeah, I was really just looking at like, more looking at programs that offered like culture broadly, like communication and culture, and
right.
This will be sort of the artifact that I will be using to look more at culture. But so yeah. Anyways, that was a long way to say that it was a very good conference.
Hopefully for the people listening, this has been an interesting discussion. It's a very academic discussion, but I think it goes to the heart of what I think all of us are experiencing, which is we really like games. We want to look at games from an academic perspective. We might have other interests in addition to that, but like this is a big part of what we want to do. And like, how do we even do that? Right. And I feel like academia is still trying to figure that out. Like what should game studies look like at an academic level? And I think traditionally it's been, even when the people have started that, it's been, okay, well, we'll do game development, right? And we'll do that over in computer science. It'll be programming focused. And I think now we're starting to see more people move to, well, it's not just filmmaking, right? We also have film studies. We have people who look at film as art in the same way that we look at music and look at literature. And I think games, Kevin, you said that a bit earlier, right? Like games are at that level. They deserve that sort of same consideration.
Well, it's like go ahead.
No, I agree. they absolutely, and there are different types of games that people play, and different scales of games, and things that live exclusively on mobile as opposed to AAA games. I mean, there's everything out there. So there's plenty to study, certainly,
sure.
and to study in different ways. And I just think that, yeah, absolutely, it's an art form, without a doubt. It has to be studied that way.
It's like I don't remember if this is the beginning of the book that we were talking about before the podcast started. But like essentially the author talks about it in terms of like games end up being like, there's two areas that games can kind of fall under with the ludology, like the actual playing of it, which makes sense to then be in like a computer science realm to some degree. Like that's kind of where I see that, but also like the narratology, right? The story of the game in and of itself and how that's played about. And so for me, just relegating it to like one specific field doesn't make sense because of how broad both of those things do. Because like even with ludology, even if you put it strictly in computer science, as I mentioned, one of the chapters in that book was about the way in which you interact with the controller is like a very queer thing because of, and this is for Octodad, by the way, because the controller, the thing you're supposed to use to control the body, it actually doesn't control the body in the way that it's supposed to. So to me, that's a very like, a very weird concept that I think is going to have an impact on players in a particular way that speaks to like social sciences / like critical scholars and how they would approach that differently.
Yeah, and I mean, you can start going off of that and start talking about like disability studies.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Like, so like I remember when the Switch first launched. It was in March, and I got it, and it was International Disability Awareness Day or something.
Yeah.
I forget what the exact name of it was, but so I have the Switch. I have 1-2 Switch. 1-2 Switch has the ping pong game, right? And you like play it by sound. Like you don't see anything. You don't look at the screen or anything. And so I had students in class, and I was like, okay, well, come up here. We're going to try this out, and I'm going to blindfold you. We're going to play this game. And like, I want you to think about like, well, how does it change when you like take away like what you view as like a primary sense, right? Visual particularly with games. How do you still play games? And so, we did that in class, and it was a fun little like experiment in class to do. But like now we have that happening in games, right? Like, so the accessibility in games, like I know the newest Forza games have where it'll make different sounds like as you start to go off the road and everything. And fighting games have implemented that with making sounds showing you how close you are to an opponent, right?
Yeah.
Like essentially almost like sonar, I guess. In
Dead by
effect.
Daylight had added like where it has like a heart in the middle of the character so that you can see when the killer's coming instead of just being able to hear the heartbeat of the killer.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's one of those things that you start thinking about, okay, well, like this actually changes the way people interact with games, right? And yeah, I mean, I feel like we could talk another 2 hours
For sure.
on this.
Yeah.
We should probably get to the rest of the show, but we can talk about this more later in addition. But let's talk about what you've been playing. Mario, we'll start with you. I have a guess that maybe you haven't been playing a lot since you were away at a conference.
Yeah, I haven't played a ton recently. The last thing I did play was just more Stardew Valley for the multi-world. Kevin, you haven't probably heard, since you haven't heard us talk about this, there's a program called Archipelago, and it's like a community modding program where people have modded games as randomizers. Are you familiar with randomizers? Okay. But with this it creates a multi-world of randomizers. So like if I'm playing Stardew and you're playing Ocarina of Time and Justin's playing Dark Souls, I might find in my Stardew game, I might find like your hook shot.
Oh,
and
interesting.
you might find, I don't know, things that are in Dark Souls. I don't play those games.
My sword.
Yeah. And Justin in his game might find like my radish seeds, and through the servers they like send over across all these different items. And
Okay, so as an example then, walk me through this. So we find a 3D object in a 2D game? How does this work?
So basically, at least for Stardew, there are a number of different like checks that you can do. So like harvesting a crop for the first time is like a check in the game. So I harvest my first corn and it says, oh, you found Kevin's bomb bag. Okay. And then, like I said, through the servers, it would, when you boot up your game the next time you play it, you would have that bomb bag in your inventory.
Okay. So the objects aren't moving across. You're unlocking for one another.
Unlocking for one another. Yeah, there's not like I don't know I don't have access to a hookshot in my game, but there's no like visual indication of it. But anyway, so I've been playing Stardew. We've done this.
It's more like achievements, and like you trigger it and it unlocks it.
And I think a game like Stardew is kind of a hard example. Whereas like when you would open a chest in Ocarina, rather than you found whatever your thing is like, oh, you found Mario's corn seeds or something like that, and like I said, it would send it to me, and I bring it up and over explain it just because of what you're thinking, your interest in,
right?
Like this sort of emergent community and stuff like that. And so played a little bit more of Stardew as I'm working through that one. I've really fallen behind and kept held up the rest of people's gameplay experiences as they're waiting on me to find items since I've been away. But that's really all I've played. I know I've talked in the past about, the friend group that I've made through Discord and Twitch. We do these like month-long events where we sort of give out a list of games and we'll all play those games. March is the month that I like put out the list. And so we'll be playing a number of games. So tomorrow we're going to race Aria of Sorrow. So it's the first time I've played that in a while. So looking forward to that. So I'll talk about Aria of Sorrow next week.
This is always a fun game to talk about. That's a really, really good game.
Yeah.
They're doing a big new content update for Stardew Valley in March, right?
Yeah, 1.6. From what I understand, there's going to be some new dialogue and some new like festivals and events. I'm not sure what else there is, but those are the things I'm most familiar with that Concern Day announced.
Yeah, Stardew is just such a fascinating game because it's like the little game that could, and like they keep supporting it. They just put out a new update for Vampire Survivors, and I keep going back to this idea. All these big AAA publishers are struggling right now, and I think part of it is because of these little tiny games that people are buying for $10, and they're just supporting them with content for years. And so, like
if $10 being if that even Vampire Survivors what, like $2, $3?
Yeah, I think I bought it like $2 or $3 originally, and but they just keep supporting these games forever. Like you could still be playing Stardew Valley like years later,
sure,
even if you started originally, near launch and everything. So it's kind of fascinating to like look at that, because if you're a big AAA publisher, which we'll talk about here in a minute, some of the problems that they're having, you've got to be looking at these games going, how do we compete? How do we compete with Vampire Survivors? We cannot publish a $2 game and like hope for it to be this successful as that has become. Sorry, a little off topic.
No, I agree. Just, I know we've talked about it. I guess it wasn't last week. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. Was it Spider-Man was like $240 million budget or something like that?
Yeah, bigger budget than any of the films.
That's hard, one, just to recoup that cost, but also then to make something like that consistently, like every 4 years, to make a $250 million game.
Yeah.
Even Alan Wake, right, they say is not yet profitable. Alan Wake 2.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that game only sold like 2 million copies or something, or less than 2 million copies, and it was one of the most highly reviewed games of all of last year, which is kind of shocking. Like you would think Alan Wake 2, like that was a big game. That game should have sold 10 million copies already, and it's nowhere near that.
Yeah. But yeah, that's really all. I haven't really played anything else than that.
All right. Christina, what have you been playing?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I'm technically in a conference right now. I paused to come do the podcast. So I've just been playing the stuff basically that I've been playing the last few weeks. So Balatro and Dead by Daylight.
Oh, you have picked up Balatro.
Yeah, I'm not very good at it, but yeah.
It takes a while.
It does.
I'll talk more about that, but do you have anything you want to say?
I don't know. It's the reason I picked it up is because I got frustrated watching people play it who would say, "Oh, I'm gonna do this type of deck," but then not playing like that. And so it was one of those, my autism kicked in, was like, I can do this better. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess, I got paid. Let's get the game. So yeah, it's really just figuring out or getting used to the strategy, the pre-strategy, if that makes sense. So knowing when to skip the blinds, usually you skip the first 2 blinds and try to get or at least I have been skipping the first 2 blinds in order to try to beat the boss on that, so you get those 2 advantages, that sort of thing. So until you figure out what kind of hands you're playing, what is the strategy, and I am both successful and wildly unsuccessful with that.
Right.
But that's really where I am right now.
Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and jump in and talk about Balatro since we're already talking about it. So for those listening who may not have heard us talk about Balatro before, Balatro is a roguelike poker game. I don't know how better to describe it.
That's perfect. That's it.
You have set blinds that you have to reach, and you are building up your cards and collecting jokers that have effects on your hand each round, and then you're also the celestial cards, which change how much each hand is worth. So how much 2 of a kind versus 3 of a kind or a flush is worth. But I think the thing that has made that game so addictive is the customizability of the way that you approach it, right? Yeah. So I'm really big on, okay, I want to get jokers that that the multiples and everything build up continuously as I'm playing the game, right? So there's the ones you can get that are okay, this is 4 times whatever your hand is, but then you can get the ones that are, well, every time you play a celestial card or a tarot card, we're going to upgrade this. Yeah. And then so that just really changes your entire strategy of how you're playing, right?
Right.
So Mario, I know you mentioned the pair of pants, right? So you get the pair of pants Joker card, and every time you play 2 pair, it upgrades.
Yep.
And it's and so you start building that up, and you're starting off getting 50 per hand, and then I was playing yesterday, and I was getting 500,000 per hand.
Wow.
I was playing, and I feel like that's a game that the more you play, the more the kind
For
of
sure.
levels of strategy you start to kind of uncover.
Because you also unlock different decks and different jokers along the way too, which can kind of help inspire those various strategies.
Which is very smart.
Yeah.
It's very smart game design to have unlockables in there.
Sure. And I realized through this that I'm kind of I'm a sucker for those games that are simplistic repetition, but involve that strategy. That's basically what Dead by Daylight is. That's what The Binding of Isaac is, which is another game that I'm really into. That's what Balatro is basically, is simplistic repetition that you have to figure out. Basically,
it's what roguelikes are.
Yeah, for sure.
I was just sort of chuckling throughout, you talking about, I think it's so addictive to this. I think it's just so addictive because it's gambling, the exact reason why poker is addictive.
Listen.
But anyway, and it's not a knock. I bought the game. I haven't played it yet, but I've watched a lot of it. And I've got friends who are playing it, and I'm watching them play it. But we were talking about this last night. I was like, yeah, I mean, it's a good game, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so addicting. Is like, this is like one of those things that like people generally find incredibly addicting.
But gambling with real money makes me cry. Like I can't.
Exactly. All the risk is gone.
Yeah.
Well,
It's just pure dopamine, baby.
but I think that is the clever thing about it, because you aren't bidding.
Sure,
Right.
yeah,
Like, so there is an abstraction from normal gambling.
Yes, of
right?
course.
Like as you're playing it, you don't feel like you're gambling, but you are.
Yeah.
Because you are choosing this joker because you are thinking, well, if I can get far enough with this joker, it's going to build up his value and be a lot more valuable than this other joker.
This makes me fussy.
I just think about like the odds of the deck. We were talking about this, yesterday as well. Of like a friend, like, I wonder, is it really this easy to make straights? And I was like, well, you have access to all 52 cards, whereas you don't typically have access to all 52 cards when in like a normal game of poker.
You actually have more than 52 cards because you can add cards to
it. It's like, so that like there's like the strategy of like, all right, well, I've got 3 3s left in the deck and I need a 3, so I'm gonna just like throw away these 5 cards
It
and
like
hope
counts
that like
the cards for you.
probability. So like that's what it's talking like. There's like a very much a card counting aspect to it.
Damn it. I mean, this realization just makes me fussy.
But yeah, no, I've like I said, I this is not a knock on the game. I think it's really fun to watch. It's really from everything that I hear, it's really fun to play, and I'm looking forward to getting a chance to play it. But yeah, like I said,
Well, we've said it before on here. It's a great podcast game. It is. I think one of the reasons I'm getting so much time into it is because I can be listening or watching something else while I'm playing it. Yeah. Like it doesn't require my full attention. And I think a lot of card games work like that. We talk about Marvel Snap works like that, right? Sure. Like I do not need my full attention on Marvel Snap. It's why I think it's so weird, the people who are like going and punching in like their hand into like websites to tell them what to play.
Meta deck, yeah.
Right. Like
even more than that, it sounds like, actually.
Yeah, it sort of like killed the competitive element of that game for me, but like this game, you're just playing against yourself, against the computer, essentially. It's just it's a really well done game. Like to come out and be that well polished and that well put together. I have already put 20 plus hours into that game, and I have no doubt when it gets to the end of the year that will be my most played game of the year. Just because
it's so easy.
Yeah, it's so easy, and I can sit down and play it in 30 minutes versus a much larger commitment game.
Yeah, one of the reasons I hadn't bought it, I was like, do I buy it for the computer or do I buy it for the Switch? Because like, where am I actually going to play it? Well, I ended up just buying it for the computer, but I think that's like a hurdle that people will have to like, or they're just like, I'll just buy it on both.
Because I did the Switch because it's one of those, it's like I have to have the screen while I'm watching the screen. And so, yeah, I ended up doing the Switch.
Yeah, like you want to be holding it. You want to have the screen right there.
Yeah.
There's a streamer who posted on Twitter. He was like, I've never been more excited for a 4-hour flight in my life. And you just see him holding his Switch with Balatro loaded up.
I don't know if I could do that for 4 hours. Maybe. I'm sure I have played 2 or 3 straight hours of the game, so probably I could. But yeah. So anything else?
No.
I realized we derailed.
No. Balatro and Dead by Daylight are pretty. Like I get Dead by Daylight's always on my list, but it's just watching more of the last update.
Cool. So. All right, Kevin, what have you been playing?
Yeah. Again, I have really strange gaming habits where I'm in and out of titles and rarely ever complete something in the first run, and I always go back. But I'm playing Outer Wilds for the first time. And so I'm behind everybody on that one, so don't spoil it.
All right, I have to ask this every time. Which one is Outer Wilds and which one is Outer Worlds?
Oh, well, I can answer that. So Outer Wilds is it's harder to answer. They both have to do with space and space exploration.
And they came out like 6 months apart.
Yeah, terrible timing. Outer Worlds, when did these come out? 2020, I think. both of them.
That sounds
Does that sound right?
Sounds right.
Yeah.
So
I know I was still in Boise when they came out, so that had to be at least 3 years ago.
Yeah. Outer Worlds was made by Obsidian, right?
Yes.
So it's the first person, RPG, space exploration, big sandbox environments.
Fallout-like.
Yeah,
to some degree.
Fallout-like.
That's-
Outer Wilds is just
Is that the time loop?
yes.
Okay, I got those completely backwards. Then
So now you got it. Okay, yeah. 22-minute time loop. Outer Wilds.
I get them confused all the time too. And I've played Outer Wilds and I still get them confused.
Whenever I ask somebody, have you played Outer Worlds? They say no, but have you played Outer Wilds? And that's how those conversations go back and forth all the time. So I'm playing that and Final Fantasy 16,
Oh, wow.
which I'm enjoying, and Spider-Man 2, and Wingspan. Am I allowed to talk about board games, tabletop
Sure.
games? I don't know if
Yeah.
I'd be kicked out of the podcast for that.
How dare you?
Okay,
There's
so-
a digital version of it.
Oh yeah, I could have just bluffed and said, no, playing actual Wingspan on tabletop, which probably one of my most favorite games of the recent years. So
It's a good one. We got it for my stepsister's boyfriend for Christmas, and so we played it a bunch over winter break. That's
beautiful.
It's a fun game.
isn't
Yeah.
it beautiful?
Yeah.
I just love it.
So tell us a bit about Wingspan, because it's a game I've seen, but I've never played.
Oh yeah, so it's technically competitive, although it doesn't feel that way. It's pretty relaxed, pretty
Yeah.
chill sort of competition. But
There's no like what I do directly impacts like what you do.
yeah, it's all really about your own path in constructing an aviary.
Okay.
So you're trying to get birds into different types of habitats, so like the woods or the grasslands or the water, and you fill these areas with birds, and then they have certain effects. You get eggs into their nests, and then you play a number of rounds, and at the end of the rounds, there are different things that award points. So it might be how many birds you have total, how many eggs in the nests total. What else? What else can you do? Flocks of birds sort of tucked. So you tuck cards under each other. So, and the cards are
There's
just
like
really
the
beautiful.
predator birds as well.
Yes,
Yeah,
so-
yeah.
Yeah. So like a hawk could, catch a smaller bird of a narrower wingspan, and that card gets tucked, and it's very sad and tragic. But it's really mellow and really beautiful.
Yeah, just to go back to that conference really quick, there were 2 talks on board games, what they would call business games. And so the original was like German business games from like 1965 to 1980 or something like that. And then the very next talk, I think was his student, sort of like, and here's what these games look like today. The original were like very much these like economy games, like these are games if you run a business, like these are the games you're going to have your business people play, thinking about like economies. And so the next person talking was like, and this is kind of what they've shifted into is like Settlers of Catan or Wingspan, or
Ticket to
there was
Ride.
like just like these games where you're still like, you have these resources and you like are very much building an economy, but we've just changed the aesthetic of them.
Right.
Okay.
But yeah, no, and it's a very fun game.
I'm looking at the expansions online it's really cool. Like they have an Oceania. It's basically they're regionally based. So like Oceania, they have a European, they have an Asian expansion that has a beautiful peacock on the front of it. It's really cool.
Yeah, not to take sort of take over what you're talking about, but yeah, it's a great game, and there very much is like a strategy of like how you go about deploying your birds, right. Because they can, some of them can only go into certain habitats, and how you get like the food in order to like make sure that you can like pay their costs, and so
Right.
yeah, it's a really interesting game.
Yeah.
So it's cool that you've been playing it.
I always find myself, I'm trying to get birds into the habitats, right? And then get eggs on my birds, but then it costs eggs to get more birds into more habitats. So I'm always like, okay, by the end of round 4, have I spent my eggs or not? Or like, you know what I mean? So I'm always this kind of like throttling how I'm using those resources, trying to, cache food and all of that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
yeah.
It's really wonderful. And then there are some nice surprises in the ways that the cards, the abilities sort of scaffold together.
Yes,
And,
yeah.
especially by the end of like the 4th round, where card abilities have stacked in really nice ways
Yeah.
that pay off. So
And I think the thing that's also really smart in the way that the game is designed is how I don't remember what the cards are called, but like you at the very beginning of the game, you draw like the 2 cards. It's like if at the end of the game you have this,
Right.
or if at the end of the game you have that. So it like also directs you.
Right.
You don't have to build your sort of aviary in that way, but it's like I think one of them that I had was like for every bird you have that eats rats. So it's like I don't remember, it was like the rodent vor or something like that. You got like so many additional extra points. So it's like the ways that you prioritize, then the building of that aviary. Or if you have birds, the number of birds you have like under a particular sort of wingspan. So like I think that's a really smart way, because then it really does feel like I'm doing this, you're doing that. So we're going for different things, but there is still that level of competition in a sense, but it doesn't feel competitive outside of at the end of the game, I'm trying to win, but that also doesn't have to necessarily be the goal. Like the goal can also just be the playing of itself.
Sure.
Excuse me, but are you describing Balatro?
I don't think so. I'm missing the joke here.
You are.
When you play it, you'll understand.
Yeah.
'Cause, a lot of what you just said is exactly Balatro.
You're gonna like it. In other words, you're gonna like it.
Sorry. It was
No,
just
you're
a
good.
joke.
But like I guess, I mean, I guess in the sense of like, you're building in a particular path of whatever the jokers you have, but whatever that sort of, like I said, I don't remember what the type of cards are called.
Bonus cards or something.
That sounds right, but
They're just little incentives.
Yeah.
And, it adds layers, I think, of motivation.
And even just then with like the, there's that layering, or like, I guess the most competitive part of the game is how at the end of each round, there's like number of birds in this habitat,
Right.
first place, second place, third place. So like there's like, it's interesting. Like the competitive part of the game isn't in the game itself. It's like almost like an outside factor.
Right. Because
It's
ultimately, I mean, you get to the end of it and you've built an aviary with birds in it. And that's good enough for me. When I get to the end and just looking at the bird artwork and reading, there's like little facts about the birds. And again, all of the materials are just so beautiful to look at. And I come from a drawing and painting background originally. So I'm like looking at these things and
I was about to say, it makes sense with like the animation stuff that you were talking about, that would be a part that you would gravitate towards.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Final Fantasy 16, so I have to know, like, how are you liking the Game of Thronesing of the Final Fantasy?
It's all right, I think. That's a tough question. I'm not all that far into it either, but I do feel like, okay, I get it, right? Like there are political forces at play. There are kingdoms battling, and it feels like that. It sometimes feels like a pastiche of medieval political drama. So like there are times when I feel like it's just a little too sterile in that presentation, or it feels like I get it, right?
Yeah.
It's like medieval, capital M. And but the gameplay I find really exciting. So I'm kind of back and forth between sort of sitting through a lot, and this sounds like I'm just totally dragging Final Fantasy. And I feel bad. I feel guilty about it now as I say it out loud. But it feels like I'm sort of sitting and watching things that I can predict, and then kind of briefly being sort of let off the leash to go do something, and then being put right back on it. I don't know. But again, this is early. That's my early review. It was probably unfair as I think back to the last moment of what I just said.
Well, I played the demo, and that was my reaction to the demo. And so it kind of prevented me from playing the full game. I mean, I also just didn't have the time. So it was like one of those things of, I'm going to prioritize my time over here on this game instead, because this game is not connecting with me. I thought the combat was pretty fun.
Yeah.
But everything story related, I was like, oh, I'm just not that interested in this.
Yeah.
And like maybe it gets really interesting at some point, but it's not hooking me in the way that older Final Fantasies have.
Right.
So I just always wonder how
weird
people.
enough too. It's like not as strange and unexpected as other Final Fantasy games. And I think some of the things it asks me to do as the player are just not all that fun. Like it keeps me. It feels very linear early on, and like it's not trusting me to go and make my own fun. But then when it decides, okay, you, Kevin, you can go and do this now, and you should feel good about it. It was like deliver 3 bowls of stew in one little tavern, and that was like the big thing I got to do was to walk around in one little room.
Oh no.
And it felt like go kill 10 rats or bring three batteries here. But I'm trying to push through that, right? And see what it will yield.
No, I mean, I completely relate to that reaction because I love the old Final Fantasy games. But like, I think part of what I always loved about those games was it was a Japanese take on European medieval like history fantasy, right? And it was like this weird mashup that always made it feel like something completely different than that you got anywhere else. And I think as like particularly with Final Fantasy 16, what I played of it, what I have seen of it, my problem was always, well, this feels almost like a Western developed game. And that's not what I liked about Final Fantasy. I liked the sort of what to me culturally felt weird. It's not weird, I'm sure, to Japanese players in the same way, but like that's what always was appealing to me.
Right. Even just, I think having things that are unexpected, not even weird, but just like unexpected, right? Or nice surprises. I think Final Fantasy IX for me will kind of always be like the example for me. Maybe 7 for other people, right? But Final Fantasy IX, I mean, a theater troupe on airships in weird kingdoms. I mean, so cool, right?
Right.
But I agree. I think 16 feels Western distinctly.
Which is a weird like criticism to make of a game, right? Like it sounds weird to say that, but I think it's a valid criticism.
It's a criticism that is made from like people who study video games. Honestly, like that's what it feels like.
Right.
Or just play an awful lot.
Fair.
All right, is that everything?
Yeah, that's everything for now. Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, we've already talked about Balatro plenty, so I'm not going to talk about Balatro anymore, except to say Balatro is really good. People should play Balatro. I'm going to spread the good word of Balatro. The other thing, so I haven't had a whole lot of time to play, probably because of Balatro. So I did play a little bit more of Arzette. So this is the... the Zelda CDI spiritual successor. Is I guess the only way to describe this. So Mario, you're kind of looking at me weird.
Said, did you talk about this last week?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I have not listened to last week's episode.
Have
yet.
you seen Arzette? Any?
No, I have no idea what this game is.
Okay, so you know the CDI Zelda games?
I do.
Like Wand of Gamelon.
Yep.
So they're most famous for their like bizarre full motion video animated segments.
Yeah.
Where like all the characters it's constantly zooming in and out on the characters and they're constantly moving and doing weird stuff with their hands.
Yeah.
So somebody was like, let's make one of those.
Okay.
And we're going to copy the animation style, which they get fairly accurate. Looks really like that classic animation from those Zelda CDI games.
All right, I Googled it. You're not talking about Arzette heating and air conditioning?
No.
Okay.
What are their reviews like?
But that sounds like an amazing game.
Like Power Wash.
Yeah, Power Wash Simulator all over again. We'll have to tell Alicia. She'll love it.
The Jewel of Faramore?
Yeah, the Jewel of Faramore is the subtitle. So they went and they made one of those games. The levels, the graphics of the levels as you're playing through, it's a side-scrolling action game. But like the thing that makes this game so amazing, and I talked about this last week, is they got it so right. Like they got so much of what a CDI game, like particularly those Zelda games, but in general a CDI game, and even more broadly what CD-based games of that era looked and felt like. Mm-hmm. So like one of the things is like the audio mixing. So like when a character is speaking, like they'll be saying their line, but like then they fade out the end of it to fade in the next one. So like there's this weird sort of like fade at the end of the way people speak, which is a product of the time of like, I'm sure something to do with the engineering of the games. But like they implement that into this game. So there is an obsession to detail with like, hey, we're going to make this tribute to a terrible game. Like nobody thinks those Zelda CDI games are actually good. Like, I mean, maybe there is, but like, I've never, the big goof on those is how terrible those games are. And here is a game that is incredibly faithful in trying to recreate the look and the feel and the sound of those games. But then they go a step further and they actually make it play well. So like the thing about those games is they play terribly. So like you don't want to play them. Like people want to go back and play them as a goof, like on a stream or something, but they're actually terrible games. It's not just that they're weird looking, they actually play terribly. And so they actually made this one where it actually plays well. And I'm not going to say it's like the greatest side-scrolling action game you'll ever play, but like the controls are infinitely better. The hit boxes of enemies and the way you interact with them is infinitely better. But then they've also copied things like one of the sort of keys of those original games was, they have these like sort of, they look like sort of hand painted backgrounds. And you didn't always know what you could interact with in the background. So like you didn't know like, can I jump on top of this rock? Or is that just a background element? Because it's all sort of painted on a flat layer. So it all looks like it's either interactive or not interactive. And so they copied that, which is sort of an insane thing to copy because it's bad for game design, but it also like copies over the feeling of that. And like they've gone to the effort of like trying to make sure it actually plays well and giving you those like cues that the original games did not give. And then there's more with it. Like the voice acting is like suitably terrible. And I think last week when I was talking about it, it very much feels like, hey, we got people from the local community theater to come in and do the voices. So like this guy is doing his like best Bobcat Goldthwait impersonation. Right? Like he's like, like while he's talking, and you're like, I get what you're going for, but like you're not Bobcat. Like, but it feels like what a lot of voice acting in games of that era was, where again, it wasn't professional actors, right? It was this person from community theater or Bill from accounting we're going to bring in and have this. And so they're trying to recreate that in the game. And it's just such a weird game. And the thing I talked about last week is so weird. And those Zelda CDI games are such a distinct moment, and nobody ever made a game like that again, right? So we have these games. You can play them now via emulation and everything. But those games didn't influence anything that came after them. Right? Nobody ever went out and made a game that feels and plays like those games because they're just so terrible. So this is almost like an alternate history of, well, what if those games had continued? What if those games had been successful? What if the CDI had been successful and people continued to make games in that style? So it makes it really interesting to think about, what if somebody who had no connection with the Zelda CDI games, had never seen even like footage of those games on YouTube, picked up and played this game today? How would they react to this game? Because it would almost be like mind melting, like as you're playing it. Like why would you design a game like this? This is insanity to make a game like this. And to see somebody like do something faithful to that actually works at the same time is really interesting to me. Because it's almost like is playing on nostalgia, but it's nostalgia that nobody actually has because nobody actually, like so few people actually had a CDI at the time. So like it's more nostalgia for this internet meme almost that people have developed, but then taking that and turning it into something good. So it's almost like, what's the The Room.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the terrible movie. It's almost like if somebody was like, okay, well, what if we took the story of that movie and tried to make like an actual good movie out of it? Which is like, but we're going to keep a lot of the look, the cinematography and everything that's terrible in that movie. We're going to keep that in this like new version that we're making. And it's such a weird, is like sort of a weird critical like experiment to do with something. And so, like I said last week, I don't know if I can recommend this game to people. Like you almost have to be like a student of game history or, like approach it, maybe an academic from a critical perspective. But like somebody who just casually plays games, I don't know that I could recommend this game to them, but I almost want to recommend it more to them because I want to see how do they respond to it. Because I know how I'm responding to it. I'm responding to it as somebody who like studies games and teaches games, but like I'm a very tiny audience for that. And the people that I've been reading, right, are game critics. So again, a very tiny audience. And I don't know how the general public will respond to it. And maybe it's just a game that the general public never experiences, right? But it's cool. Like if you have any sort of affinity for those Zelda CDI games, this is like a cool thing to experience. So that's Arzette, the Jewel of Faramore. All right, let's move on to news. And we have quite a bit of news. So Alicia's not here, so we have to enjoy all the Pokemon Day announcements for her. They announced Pokemon Legends Z-A. I don't know how that's supposed to be pronounced. Pokemon Legends ZA.
Pokemon Legends Pizza.
Oh. Yeah, there you go. Did you grow up calling it ZA?
No.
So.
There's a good SNL sketch that goes into that, but it was the things in sort of the friend groups was Pokemon Legends Pizza, and this is the first game where you're going to get to smoke the Zaza in a Pokemon game. So
appealing to a whole new audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Pokemon Company. It is set entirely within Lumiose City. Which that was not clear originally, but that has come out in a statement since that the entire game is set within the city. Lots of people are saying this is tied into the X and Y games because I guess Lumiose City is in those. This is where we need Alicia, our Pokemon expert. And then the trailer for it shows it's kind of weird. It shows building plans, blueprints, and it starts off with these sort of older sepia tone blueprints and everything. So it looks like you're building this city in the past, and then it transitions into this. A Pikachu appears, and the Pikachu starts running across the plans, and then it transitions into a Tron-like future where everything's neon. So a lot of people. Apparently, the first Pokemon Legends involves time travel, so people think you're going to build a city in the past and then travel to it in the future and interact with it in some way.
Did you play the first Legends?
I did not.
Oh, okay.
I always wanted to because it was the first Pokemon game in a long time that had really kind of interested me because I thought it looked cool.
It's a good game. That's interesting. I don't know the deep Pokemon lore. I was thinking originally that this was the sort of village you're in the original, and you're moving into the future. But realizing now I didn't sort of make the Lumiose City connection. That's really interesting. Thinking about the time aspect and how it's you're going to see maybe the progression of this city over time.
I mean,
I don't know, but yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be like Dark Cloud. I don't know if you ever played those games. They're PlayStation 2 games, but you go out and do sort of Zelda dungeon stuff and come back and build a town. And so you would build the weapon shop, and there would be a person running the weapon shop so you could buy better weapons. that's sort of what it makes me think of, or the sort of granddaddy of that kind of subgenre, which is ActRaiser on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, the one that I kind of think of as a more recent example would be 13 Sentinels, where
Sure.
you're sort of like, not to do spoilers, but like it appears as though all these people from different time periods are sort of traveling across, sort of in the same area at different periods of time. So, yeah, I'll be interested to see. Like I said, I really like the legend, so this will definitely be one that I'll pick up.
That is not coming until next year, which has spurred some speculation that that game is pushed to 2025 because the current rumor is that the Switch 2, or whatever they end up calling it, has also been pushed to 2025. And I guess we'll go ahead and address this now. It's later in the rundown, but the rumors for that is that there were two reasons to delay it, because all the rumors have been pointing to the Switch 2 was coming out this fall sometime. And now it looks like it's coming out March of next year, which would be the same time that the original Switch came out in March. And that the speculation is that two things have caused this. One, they wanted to make sure they could get enough parts so that they could build up enough inventory, because they didn't want like a scalping issue like we had obviously with the PlayStation 5, particularly recently. And then two, that they wanted to give their developers more time to finish games, so that the original first-party Nintendo games that they'll launch with would actually be ready to go like day one, right? So now you're taking a Pokemon game and saying, everybody expected a new Pokemon game this year, and now all of a sudden, oh no, we're releasing it next year. It makes a lot of people wonder, was that Pokemon game supposed to be a launch or near launch Switch 2 game actually? And Nintendo has not obviously commented on that. They're not going to say, oh yeah, this is actually a Switch 2 game.
It would be smart of them to to put a Pokemon game on like an early release for like a Switch 2 or whatever, just because they know it's going to sell. So
yeah. It's one of those few franchises that's guaranteed to sell like 20 million.
Exactly.
Right? Alicia will buy like 6 of them copies herself.
I do think this will, at the very least, even if it is a launch title for the Switch 2, or again, whatever it's called, it will also be a Switch 1 game. Like it'll be a cross. I just think in terms of like the largest sort of player base.
Especially like they made that specific announcement that this is the first time Nintendo is doing anything like that. Or at least they called it something like, was it cross-platform? I don't remember. But
Like doing backwards compatibility.
Yes, that's the phrase I couldn't think of. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. They've done that the last couple of systems, right?
Yeah.
The last couple of systems they've launched with a Zelda game that was cross-gen. And so it kind of makes
2 of the last 3, because you had Twilight Princess on the GameCube and Wii, and then Breath of the Wild. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense that, okay, we'll put this out and have it on, have a Switch version and a Switch 2 version, right? Whether that's the same version, like you get both and it's just enhanced, or they're selling 2 entirely separate games. I guess I don't know. I guess none of us know what Nintendo's doing. I'm not sure Nintendo knows what they're doing at this point.
Again, just thinking about all the things people on Twitter are saying, oh, you can play the Switch 2 version at 16 frames per second, or the Switch 1 version at 12 frames per second. Just with how choppy the original one was, but how choppy the most recent Pokemon game was as well.
Sure. They also announced the Pokemon trading card game Pocket, which is a new mobile game, they already had a Pokemon trading card game, and this is a new version, right?
There was not browser, but like a software to play the trading card game on PC. I don't know if it was also on mobile. I wouldn't be surprised if it was.
And maybe I'm thinking, maybe there's a Switch one. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. I feel like there had been a trading card game before. I know there was like an old one for the Game Boy.
There was the one that the Game Boy one, and then there was a trading card game too, just in Japan. Okay. But like I said, I know the same way that like Magic has a software to play on your computer. I know Pokemon has that as well, but I don't know if it's been on phones before.
They showed this off. I mean, Alicia excitedly sent text to the group about it. So I know she's real excited, and had like a neat little animation where you like rubbed your finger across the screen to tear open the pack.
Yeah.
Aw,
So
I love that.
I can see that being like to Pokemon fans being very exciting.
Yeah.
Right.
The immersive cards, Alicia talked about that as well. That part looks very cool, where it, sort of has the art of the Pokemon, and then you can like sort of go into that piece, and it like broadens out in terms like what the landscape that they were in. That part, just like the art, getting to like explore that and like the expansion of those pieces. That was really cool.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this idea of virtually tearing the package open.
Yeah.
Because I think with digital trading card games, I always feel a little bit torn about like I want the cards, right? Like,
There's like
Star
a ritual
Realms.
of opening it.
Yeah. And having like physical media, and it brings physical media and then the simulation of that together in one thing, living on a phone. I don't know. I always feel strange about it. I'm curious what you all think about that. Like this simulation of a physical product, or even opening a physical product on your phone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess not to be too cynical about it, but I mean, I know we talked about like, the Balatro and like the gambling aspect, like that kind of is what cracking booster packs is, right? The Pokemon Company or Wizards of the Coast will never admit that this is gambling, but like it's basically gambling.
Yeah.
But I mean, that goes back even further to baseball
Oh,
cards.
of course.
When I was
Absolutely.
a kid collecting baseball cards, right? That was the excitement of buying a pack and like, am I getting a King Griffey Jr. in here, right?
We will never address the secondary market of like these cards are all worth the same. But I don't know if you've ever played Magic or have looked at like Magic Arena, but like they do something similar as well. But like this one, that one kind of just like you click a button and it sort of the card pack like opens up and you see all the cards. This one, like the actual like physical swiping of it, it adds like something tactile to the experience. Like in the dopamine hit is and you get 2 free packs per day.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure watching it, like when you rub your finger across the screen, is that like a preloaded animation, or is it actually tracing your finger where it interacts with the pack?
Okay, go vertical along like the edge of the pack and open it like that.
Right. Like I mean, I didn't know, like, because to me the second one is a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
Right. Like, because then there's an unpredictability to it, right? And like when I used to buy baseball cards, right? Like I was collecting, so I was very meticulous in how I opened a pack, right? Because you didn't want to bend the corners or something. And to me, that's kind of interesting because it adds that sort of customizability, right, to how you interact with this.
Well, and that's where it was interesting as well, like because watching it, there was almost a disconnect because it like. The swipe across, it almost looked as if you were like cutting the top off of the thing. Whereas like when I think about it, I think about like you open it more from like that seal in the back.
Yes.
Right.
And so like watching that was like, there was almost like a disconnect. Like that's not how you open up cards, but I guess that's how you would open up cards in this sort of world with like a zipper, almost like a zipper top type of thing. But that it is really interesting. And bringing up the point of like the process of opening a digital sort of media.
My hope is that it would be like Metal Gear Rising, like you cut that package however you like.
Sure, yeah.
And have the little, for me as a user, that would be, I think, more gratifying and a little more haptic, and I get to sort of slice and dice the package.
Well, it's also like what Justin mentioned with like the customizability of like the ritual itself of opening the packs. Like different folks are going to do it in different ways, and that's part of the magic of trading card games.
And I think there will still be something really fun if multiple people do it. Again, I think about like you know, when I was doing my undergrad at Chico, friends and I, we would go to the comic book store and we would just be like, hey, what do we buy? We'll buy a pack of the latest booster, the latest Magic set. And then we would just sit there and we would open the pack. They're like, oh, what'd you get? Oh, what'd you get? And like the fact that I think this will allow for something like that. And,
I'm watching a video of it right now. It looks like the top of the pack is like, you know how when you get something that has like a zipper added at the grocery store, like the top of it, it's very obvious that that's the part you cut so that it can
Like
be
it's perforated.
Yes, yes. That's what it looks like. So it looks like that there's a way to open the packs, but that see, it's just that purple. So it's even a different color. Like the pack itself has, it looks like this one looks like it has Pikachu on it, and then the very top of it's a solid purple. And when he ran his finger across it, it just cut off the purple thing at the top.
Well, that may be it. That's less interesting to me as somebody, you know, playing around with it.
Yeah.
But that's probably not an issue to most people.
Yeah,
It's probably also significantly easier to design and develop.
for sure.
Oh, I'm sure. Yes.
I think, we're kind of asking a lot of the right the touchscreen interface to fully replicate the physical experience. But
I don't
it's
know.
interesting.
Like
we're all kind of
Fruit
leaning that
Ninja.
way. Yeah,
Like they do a Fruit Ninja, right? Like that. I feel like you can trace where a finger is going.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, sure.
Like I suppose the rendering of the pack becomes the issue.
I think technically it's totally achievable.
Sure.
Right? Like mechanically, I think just like how do we reconcile, like I want this to be as physical looking and feeling as possible, but I'm only willing to engage with it on a touchscreen, you know?
Right.
So it's just kind of a weird, like the medium is at odds with itself there
Yeah.
in a strange way. But yeah, I think you're right. Technically, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to slice it anywhere, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So there's our Pokemon minute.
Alicia.
So less happy news than the Pokemon announcements. There were some other Pokemon announcements, but they kind of get down to the weeds.
Yeah, I don't know. All those other games are the mobile games.
Right. So less happy is we've been talking about this all year. Obviously, it goes back to last year, and it feels like it's only accelerated into 2024. More layoffs in the game industry. So we were obviously talking about Microsoft and some of the fallout of their layoffs, as you know, the FTC has come back and said, "Hey, well, we approved you buying Activision because you told us you weren't going to lay anyone off," and Microsoft said, "Sorry, like that's what we did." PlayStation has announced their own layoffs. They have laid off 8% of their staff, approximately 8%. They said that's about 900 employees. They have closed the London studio, which there was a photo of PlayStation CEO Jim Ryan, where last week he had went and visited the London studio, and there's several team members like posed with him in a picture, and they're all very excited. And then the very next week, he just closes the entire studio, and all those people lost their jobs. But there were also layoffs at Naughty Dog, Gorilla, Firesprite, and Insomniac. Also, as part of this, they have canceled an in-development Twisted Metal live service game. So this is the Twisted Metal game I feel like we've talked about a few times on this podcast. It was never officially announced, but it's been rumored they were working on a new Twisted Metal game to go along with the streaming series on Peacock. And so that game has apparently been canceled. This is one of their 12 live service games that PlayStation was working on, along with the Last of Us live service game, which they also canceled recently. So like we always talk about, these stories are always very sad. You know, this is people's livelihood. People lost their jobs. There's, you know, it's not funny. It's not like entertainment. We're not talking about it for that perspective, but it is sort of important to, like, I think, discuss these issues because, you know, you can look at some of this and say, okay, well, they're laying off people at Firesprite and London studio, both of those studios, it's my understanding, have been mostly working on VR games lately. We've talked about how PlayStation VR 2 has basically been dead from launch and not, nearly as well supported by Sony. So you start looking at it and go, okay, well, that maybe makes some sense. Like, you are pivoting away from VR, so you're going to like cut these studios. You could have assigned them to do something else. It's not like people can only work on VR games. But where I think this gets really weird is they laid off people at Naughty Dog, Guerrilla, and Insomniac. These are their 3 big hitters, right? Like, this is their Babe Ruth and King Griffey Jr. and Willie Mays, right? Like, all together. And they laid off people from these studios. Like, if they don't have Insomniac, what does PlayStation have over the last really decade? So Insomniac is the Spider-Man games, right? So Spider-Man 1 and 2 and Miles Morales. They're also the Ratchet and Clank games. Like, this has been like their jewel in their crown. It would be like Nintendo going in and saying, hey, we're going to cut some people from the Mario team. What are you doing?
Yeah, the only other one that I feel like would come close to these is Santa Monica,
Right.
who make the God of War games. I don't know if they make anything else besides the God of War games.
Not recently.
I don't know if they, I don't know if they're still Santa Monica Studios or if there's something else now. But yeah, I mean, those are their biggest ones, because Naughty Dog is The Last of Us, Guerrilla's Horizon. Those are their biggest games. Yeah, have you said over the last decade?
Maybe Sucker Punch, maybe.
Sure.
Sucker Punch, yeah.
But smaller, probably one of the smaller ones, right?
Yeah.
Of that group.
Yeah. And I mean, so, we've talked about on here before the sort of feeling of, well, you as developers are disposable, right? And you look at, okay, well, these 3 studios are losing people. And we don't know who these people are. We don't know the exact numbers within the studios, right? Like, there's the possibility that this is, hey, we're getting rid of somebody from our PR team who, our community manager or something. Not to say those people are disposable, but like, you could say, well, those people aren't, as instrumental as some other developers within the team. But Insomniac actually put out a statement in response to this, put out a statement like basically saying, hey, we are really upset. We are really heartbroken by this and losing our team members. So like, you just think like, well, what have you been working so hard for over the last decade? Like Insomniac's been putting out like a AAA game every year for them.
And so shortly off the heels of Spider-Man 2 as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Like their only big game last year.
Like that, thinking about like this notion of like disposability almost like adds to that of like we're done with you now because our game has released. Again, and not to say that that's what it is or that's who is being laid off, but like that is, I wouldn't blame anybody if that's how they read that situation.
And there was that leak about Insomniac last year about everything they have in development, right? So there's stuff that they've announced, like the Wolverine game.
Yeah.
But part of that leak was they're working on a Venom game, an X-Men game, and then a new Ratchet and Clank game. Mm-hmm. Well, something's getting the cut there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Like probably the Ratchet and Clank game, because you're probably not canceling those Marvel games, I would guess.
Yeah.
I mean, those seem like...
Unless the budgets for them are $250 million.
Right. I mean, that's a possibility, right? We've talked about that with Xbox. Why is Xbox laying off people? Why is Xbox moving more of their games to third party and putting them out on PlayStation and Switch? And it's, how do you make money when you're spending $280 million plus on a game? Mm-hmm. Like, it's the same problem that the film industry is having right now, right? Like, all these Marvel movies have to make $1 billion to break even. And you're running into that with games as well. Like, you make a Spider-Man 2 and spend $280 million on it. How do you begin to break even? Like, not everything can be Mario Kart. sell 40 million copies, right? And most of the PlayStation titles don't sell anywhere near that. Like Nintendo's kind of alone in that rarefied air where they regularly have titles sell 20 million plus.
Yeah, I feel like outside of that, it's more franchise. And it's like the Grand Theft Auto is going to sell because,
Sure.
but that's also not specifically PlayStation. Call of Duties will sell, but like it's more. I don't know if Spider-Man is hitting those numbers. As like beloved as Spider-Man is, I don't know if Spider-Man is hitting anywhere near those numbers.
I think Spider-Man 1 was the best-selling game on the PlayStation 4.
Okay.
But like, what is that? Well, it's the best-selling first-party game. I don't think it outsold the Call of Duties. But like, what does that look like, right? I don't know offhand like what numbers that looks like, but it wasn't 40 million copies.
Yeah, I don't know.
It was like maybe closer to 20 million or something, right? And like, yeah, I mean, it's very disappointing to see this. I mean, it's disappointing, right, for us as players. There's a disappointment, but then there's the sort of capitalist Marxist like disappointment in how people are being treated. Like, like there's always been this sort of attitude in the game industry, from what I've read and heard from people talking about it, that this is one of those industries everybody wants to work in.
Yeah.
So you can kind of treat people like garbage. And, that's the film industry is much the same way. Like, there's been...
There's a line of people out the door if you don't want this job or if you can't do what we're asking you to do.
I've had friends before who did the Disney college program.
Yep.
And that's the story they always tell about that, right? Like Disney sort of treats those college students like garbage because guess what? Like there's a line out the door of college students who want to go spend a semester at Disney.
Yeah.
And not all of them have that bad experience. Some of them come back, very positive, but like they almost all say like, well, yeah, like, I mean, you're just working all the time and like you're not getting paid super well. And, it's not the dream people I think have of going to work at Disney.
It's, yeah. And as a person who makes games, and I'm not making Spider-Man 3 or anything. So like, I'm not, right. I'm talking about this at a different scale, but as a person who makes games, I can tell you that they're very hard to make.
Yeah.
They're very difficult and they're quite a puzzle. And as you say, Justin, there's like no shortage of people that would love to be working at these studios. I can't help but imagine that the people that are laid off, I mean, these were dream jobs.
Yeah.
It's not just any job
Yeah.
that they got laid off, right? But
Yeah.
like dream jobs. And I wonder what that must feel like to really have attached yourself to a project of such scope and such visibility and of such quality, right? Because these studios are no slouches. So high-end products, right? But I guess maybe that's the answer, right? Product instead of thinking about these as lasting works of art. I don't know, but it must be difficult.
I think that's the fundamental difference in how like that picture that Justin sent us of like the team with the person, like the CEO, right? It's the people surrounding the CEO, I think about it like their art, their baby, but the CEO obviously sees it as the product that gets moved, right? It's the same kind of conundrum that we have in education with the folks who teach versus some admin of viewing it as a business versus viewing it as education, right? That's something holistically different, and more so that it has different goals, I guess. Mm-hmm.
And those goals are in conflict with one another.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? Like you ask any teacher, their goal is, hey, I don't care if we just break even
Exactly.
or we lose a little money. Because like the goal is like, to teach Johnny to read.
Yep.
Right? Like they're not thinking like, like at the college level, right? Most academics I know are more than happy and willing to like try to bring students in. Like they kind of get that's part of the job. But then also, once those students get in there, they want the focus to be on their education and not everything else, right? Like, and that is the conflict. And it's sad, like, I mean, like none of us are naive. We know that PlayStation is about making money.
Yeah.
but also like it is, it's weird to see again, like these are your best studios, right? Like when they shut down some of their Japanese studios, you were kind of like, okay, well, like gaming has changed. People have moved away. The quirky games like Tokyo Jungle, like, is that going to sell in this day and age in the way that it did on the PlayStation 2? Maybe not. Or PlayStation 3. Anyways. And but like when you do it to like these top studios, you start looking at it going, oh, I don't know what we're doing here.
Yeah.
And maybe this is that point of, and we've been talking about this, you know, as we went through all these layoffs, have games gotten too big, too expensive, where they cannot sustain themselves, like at these big studios, right? We're not talking about the individual developers on Steam, right? We're not talking about the Balatro developers. We're not talking about Kevin publishing his games on itch.io, right? Like we're talking about these AAA mega publishers. And that leads us into the next story, which is if we're talking about mega publishers, there aren't too many bigger than Electronic Arts. They have also announced they're laying off 5% of their staff, approximately 670 employees. Going forward, they announced that they're going to focus on owned IP. So in other words, things they own entirely themselves, not things that they're licensing out. So like movie and, you know, comic book based games. So owned IP, sports, and massive online communities. I'm guessing they mean like The Sims with that, because I don't know what else they own that you would call a massive online community. So I'm guessing The Sims is probably what that's in reference to. I mean, they are making that new Skate game, Skate 4, which is going to be a sort of free-to-play online game. So maybe they're talking about projects like that they've been working on. That was what stood out to me, like, as kind of weird in that statement. They, as part of this, announced they had canceled Respawn's Mandalorian first-person shooter. I don't think this was actually the Mandalorian from the Mandalorian series, but you playing as a Mandalorian character in a first-person shooter game. Again, this is Respawn, right? Like this is one of their top developers, and they're canceling a project from them as they're moving away from these sort of licensed IP, I guess. They, as part of this closed Ridgeline Games, they are the developers of the Battlefield single-player segments. So, you know, the last few Battlefield games have had a single-player component in addition to the, I think, generally the bigger draw of those games, the, you know, massive online multiplayer segments. So they have closed down that developer. There is also I'll just go ahead and get this out there. They have Star Citizen developer Cloud Imperium has laid off a, quote, a small number. That's their words. They did not give out actual numbers. This is Cloud Imperium, the developers of Star Citizen, the game that has still not released after like a decade in development and has brought in over $500 million. And they're laying people off, which I would think if I was one of the people getting laid off, I'd be like, why haven't we shipped a game yet so that we can bring in more money? Like, why am I losing my job? We brought in $500 million selling people promises of starships they'll get one day. Like, it makes that feel from the outside more like the House of Cards lots of people speculate it is. Like, does that game ever ship? You know, do we get an actual Star Citizen game at any point? I know Scott has been on the podcast and talked about he's playing, you know, Star Citizen. He's one of the people who's bought the, you know, $35 version, whatever it is. But he's not playing a final game. He's not playing the game they've promised, you know, quite yet. So there is some good news out of all of this, I suppose. I guess you can look at it as some good news. Toys for Bob, the developers of Skylanders, the Crash Bandicoot and Spyro collections, and also Crash Bandicoot 4, has announced. So a few weeks ago, I feel like we talked about them with the Microsoft layoffs because it seemed like they were just shutting that studio down. It has now come out that studio is going indie. So they will no longer be under Microsoft or Activision. They also announced that they're going indie, but they're not ruling out working with Microsoft going indie. So it seems like their next project is going to be for Microsoft, which just sort of makes you think, are they going to like make a new Spyro game? But like Microsoft was like, we don't want you in-house doing this, which I guess is a cost savings, like, right? Like, but bizarre at the same time. I mean, good for them. I'm glad that team is surviving, right? Like, they've done really good work. If you've played either of those collections, I've played the Crash Bandicoot and Spyro collections. They're really quality collections where they've updated the graphics and everything. And, you know, like great value if like you haven't played those games or played those games when they originally released and want to like have that nostalgic kick. So I'm glad to see them surviving. So yeah, just generally just depressing news about people losing their jobs. You know, there's some online speculation, people going, well, is this going to be another crash of the video game industry? No, it's not. Like, the video game industry is too big at this point to crash like it did in '83. But it does seem like we might be seeing a scaling back of those really AAA large-scale productions. Like, you start to look at this and go, well, how many more Last of Us 2s or Spider-Man 2s is Sony going to finance? Yeah. Or does Sony look at this and say, going forward, we've got to figure out how to make smaller budgeted games? Because we've bet our entire business on making those AAA, you know, huge budget games. Mm-hmm. Like, that's all Sony's been making over the last 5 or 6 years. Like, you know, Sony used to, in the PlayStation 2 days, used to make little games. They used to make Irritating Stick, weird stuff, Intelligent Cube. Like,
I was on the Intelligent Cube. I had one called Buzz that like came with its own controllers.
The trivia game.
Yeah, I loved that game.
Yeah. We were talking about EA. Are any of you familiar with EA Originals? The program that they. I wonder if any of that is impacted. Right, because that's they worked with the studio that made Wild Hearts, right, to bring it to market, right. So I wonder if that whole support system for smaller studios is also affected. I hope not.
Yeah, I don't know. Like that, yeah, because they were essentially producing those games, like financing them and publishing them. Yeah, I don't know. Like, EA seems like a company, like a lot of video game companies have over the last decade or so, but like just desperately kind of lost at sea. Mm-hmm. Like, who do we want to be? Like, we know our sports, like that's pretty solidified, right? We're going to put out a new, well, it's not even FIFA anymore. It's football club, right? It's FC. Mm-hmm. We're going to put out a new one of those and a new Madden every year. We're pretty confident how those will work. But outside of that, what do we do? Right? Like, who are we? And, you know, like, this is not the EA that was doing Mirror's Edge and, you know, things like that. Those experimental, you know, there was that brief period where they got real experimental and we got really cool things out of that. It doesn't seem like they're that company anymore, obviously. So, you know, we talk about this on here. It's not meant to be depressing or sad, but like, it's part of the game industry. It has to be talked about. It's affecting the games that we're getting. It's affecting the games that we're going to play. And I think it affects the health of the people, you know, like when you start thinking the people making these games, like, I think players have a vested interest in those people being healthy and being able to continue at what they're doing. And this is not a healthy way for an industry to behave. I don't feel like. Let's see. Nintendo is suing the developers of the Yuzu Switch emulator. So this is software that you can run on your PC to emulate Switch games. They claim that Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was pirated over 1 million times pre-release.
Wow.
And it appears they're trying to put some of that blame onto Yuzu since they made this development. I think this is really interesting only because, so generally emulators, right, are completely legal. You can make an emulator to run software that's completely legal. Where they tend to get these companies or these development teams is there any like proprietary code that actually appears in the emulator, right? So sometimes it's code for the encryption of the games. And if they have that, then they can be, my understanding, not a lawyer, they can be sued over that, right? And so that's where some emulators have been shut down in the past because they have, like the BIOS or something from a game console. You can't do that. Is why sometimes you find emulators and they do not contain the BIOS and say, hey, you got to go find that on your own because we can't distribute the two together. And so Nintendo's suing them. This being Nintendo, I'm guessing, Nintendo has always been a very litigious company. They like suing people. So it seems like they probably feel like they have a strong case.
Yeah.
I'm sure they have picked apart that emulator to see, is there anything proprietary in there that they feel like, violates fair use.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like we've drawn a lot of parallels between Nintendo and Disney. Disney does a lot of the same things. It's like they feel as it's the way to protect their brand is to overanalyze things in that way, because they have figured out a formula that works, and so they're going to try to protect it at all costs, basically. So.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side to this is, yes, people should not be pirating Tears of the Kingdom. People should go buy Tears of the Kingdom. It's a new release. You can go buy it on the eShop. You can go buy it at Walmart or wherever, right? Like, I kind of have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with like people who don't have the money pirating it because you're not actually losing a sale in that case. But like if you have the money, I have the money, I don't pirate new games for that reason. I want to support the developers. But my problem when people get real hard on emulation is without emulation, we don't have a lot of the games. The preservation of history, right? So this is part of my research interests, but like even just going outside of my research interests, like this is something you can't really argue. Like a lot of games would have been lost to history without this.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's a story, every few months I feel like of, hey, we found this old NES prototype and we're going to release it, online. They did that with, was it the WCW wrestling game that never got released for the NES and somebody put it out, right? And like the only reason we can play that, right, is because of emulation. And that to me is extremely important, like to the health of this industry that, because there's a lot of games, Home Alone for the Super Nintendo, that game is most likely never going to get re-released just because of the licensing, right? Like you have to go and pay Fox or Disney, I guess now, to put that game back out. So the only way you're going to ever play that game is probably through emulation, through using an emulator. And that is a huge number of games that find themselves in that sort of situation. We've talked before about Windjammers. That Windjammers was a game that for years nobody could put back out because nobody could figure out who owned the rights to that game. So the only way that game found an audience and eventually led to a Windjammers 2 was through people emulating it. Was it in France? There's like a die-hard competitive Windjammers league. Like that game is hugely popular there. So I understand Nintendo from this perspective. Hey, we want to protect our investment. We're making these games and stuff. But the flip side of that is, you have to be really careful. You don't in trying to save the baby, you don't drown the baby in the process.
Yeah, fair. Mm-hmm.
Well, and isn't one of the arguments is always that if you pirate it, right, that Nintendo's missing out on that portion of the sale, their cut, right? Mm-hmm. But if you go buy a used NES cartridge, they're never going to see any of that money anyway. So the whole idea that old games like that, right, the ones that are at risk of being lost to history, they're never making money on those again, unless, of course, Nintendo Switch Online, right, or but which is a recent development. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's gamers' duties to, build these libraries and to play them. I think, anyways, particularly the old ones. But I would agree with you that if a game has just come out, and then there's a wake of layoffs, you should probably just go buy that game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I feel about media. And that's probably because of my background. That's what I've come up and studied, and that's what I'm, involved with. I don't steal media that you can buy conveniently, right? But when it's not available, I just don't see the problem. And I also am of the mindset, I have bought Super Mario Brothers multiple times. If I want to play it on my Steam Deck, I should kind of have the right to do that. I've given you money, Nintendo. I want to play it where I want to play it, right? But I feel that same way about movies. If I bought your movie, I should be able to watch it where I want to watch it.
Isn't that what I'm trying to remember now. Isn't that the law, right?
I'm pretty sure that's
the agreement.
The legal grounds that ROMs
if you own one,
if you own a copy of the game, there's no.
You can have a ROM.
Yeah, you can have a ROM. Right. From how I understand it,
right.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, but then that becomes complicated when you start talking about encryption and how is the ROM being created, or you're breaking encryption and doing that. So that's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. There's a provision in there that you can't break encryption. But people do. So. And again, it's good for the health of the industry long term, I think.
Yeah.
One last story here we'll get to. Norwegian researchers Camilla Nunsten, Steins, and Clara Julia Reich of Oslo Metropolitan University, sorry for butchering your names, released a study funded by the Ministry of Children and Family Affairs in Norway, saying online in-game markets integrate with everything else kids do in life, and in turn lead to bullying if not buying the right items. This is kind of a summary of it, but the story is basically these researchers in Norway were particularly interested in the way think like Fortnite, Roblox, these sorts of games that are specifically targeted at young kids, how they were affecting kids socially, and particularly their in-game markets. So you can go buy, a new Fortnite skin, right? And what they found through their research was that these kids were essentially getting bullied, right? They were getting picked on, in the way that maybe when we were in school, it was you don't have the right shoes, right? When I was a kid, it was sneakers were a big thing, right? Did you have the newest Jordans, or were you wearing, the Payless shoes, sneakers, right? And so they're finding that these kids are getting picked on because they don't have the right skin. Mm-hmm. Whatever the newest, the popular skin is and everything. And, we've talked about before, right? In Fortnite, these skins can be $15 a pop. Foam Stars, wasn't it? We were talking about that it was $40.
Yeah.
Thank goodness Foam Stars hasn't taken off. Can't make itself popular, but I just thought this was interesting, right? Yeah. Because this is obviously bullying goes on online. We know that there's a lot of research when it comes to social media, but I think there's far less research when it comes to games and like what you're able to afford within the game world, right? So like usually it's harassment in online games that gets talked about, particularly directed towards women and minority groups. But like this being, okay, well, you don't have the right avatar, so we're going to pick on you.
Yeah.
And that games are perceived as so much a part of a kid's life now that it's not this hobby. It is just as much a part of their life as, again, going to school or, what clubs they're in, I suppose.
Well, yeah, and it just like, it really breaks the like age-old theory of the magic circle with games, that like games exist in their own sort of fantasy made-up world, like to not be permeated by the real world. And that's been like debunked and, for a long time now, but it's just like, it's still like such a big part of the conversation in game studies and play studies more so than games. That, yeah, like play is absolutely going to be affected by the real world. And it makes sense the other way, vice versa, that play is going to affect, our perceptions of, these other sorts of areas of life as well. And in many ways, it reminds me of a story I saw probably earlier this week, maybe last week. So I don't know if you talked about it. I don't remember when I saw it, but there's like Arrowhead, I think, is doing like looking into cases where people are being booted from their Helldivers 2 groups. Like they're being booted from the lobbies if they don't have like the meta build out.
Oh, wow.
Of like the appropriate items to, fight the aliens or whatever, that they're being booted from. They don't know if this is like a widespread thing that's happening, but there are cases of, people being booted from lobbies because they don't have the right items in the game, which I guess to an extent I understand, but at the same time it feels ridiculous that would happen.
It's the same problem that happens a lot in these open world games, because you have, or the not open world, but like live service kind of thing, where you have people that are playing because they want to play because it's fun, and then folks who want to be sweaty about it and are trying to be overly competitive. Unfortunately, having those two folks mixed in the same bag means that kind of stuff is going to happen. I think when I hear this, I think it's definitely good that they're studying this as like the way in which games interact with children. At the same time, I get nervous about studies like this, that they fall into the wrong hands, and it becomes
it's essentially a marketing plan.
Yeah, of like, or that this medium is then therefore detrimental and they should ban. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Sure.
It's the same thing that happened with like, rock music in the late 80s, early 90s, and video games as well. That there's so much violence here, without recognizing like who gets attracted to those kind of games or kind of the behavior of it. So it's like what you mentioned, Justin, about how like bullying has always been an issue. I get nervous sometimes that studies like this distract from that fact, and that there's not a drive to address the bully problem, but rather it's we need to address the video game or the bullying in video game problem.
This is a real world behavior
Yes.
brought into a virtual space.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is, I think, interesting, right? Because one of the things, so as somebody who was like of an age where like I got the web at home pretty early, right? And actually had experiences with internet pre-web, right? Before the World Wide Web even existed. And one of the things that I think that younger people, when I talk about the history of the internet, that they have a real like lack of conception for, was the sort of utopian idea of the web in the 90s, right? That this was going to be this place where race and gender and nationality and all these like factors that we use to separate us from each other was no longer going to exist. When you got on a message board on AOL or IRC, nobody knew who you were, right? So that anonymity was really cool because you could be whoever you want it to be. And there's probably, you probably know this better than I do, there's probably a direct link with the rise of openly trans people.
For sure.
Because of that, right? Like people could like experiment in a social situation for the first time in these different identities. And so there was this like high pie in the sky utopian idea for like what the internet was going to save us. It was going to usher in a new era of humanity. And like you go back and you read stuff like Wired magazine from the 90s, like they are spouting that. Like, you know, they bought into that. And then of course we know what the internet became, right? And to see that into games, right? In this, like, and again, we know online games have always had this, right? Women face insane harassment versus male players. Male players face harassment sometimes, but like at a whole other scale, right? Like so many women who disguise their voices when they play games online, or you know, choose gamer tags that are specifically,
Androgynous.
Yeah, androgynous. Thank you. But to like now see that in a very like capitalistic way, right? Which I guess goes back to what we were talking about with the layoffs and everything. Like, hey, you don't have the cool sneakers. Get off of our Minecraft server. Which is like, it feels insane.
Yeah.
Like it feels like one of those things where you're like, am I going crazy? Like, who cares? You're playing Minecraft. Like, what do you care? But of course kids would do this. Kids do this in everything else, right?
It's just like what you mentioned, like the spatial difference. It's previously, I'm sure it still does happen, but this is happening on the playground. Now it's happening in that digital space, just because it is a problem that I believe like there's a huge epidemic of bullying, right? And then we can name things that have happened recently, right? To illuminate that for sure. So it to me, it's not surprising. Like, is it, I don't know, ridiculous? Yeah, but to me, bullying kind of is holistically, because it's definitely, but it's that learned behavior that kids have. It's just super sad.
Yeah. So like, again, not to make it a depressing podcast, but like, I think these are issues worth talking about, right? Like we're going to talk about video games. It's worth talking about these issues. And I think you're right, Christina, when you say, yeah, is this red meat for the people who want to attack video games, right? When you talk about, you know, I was just talking the other day about, you know, Night Trap in the 90s, and there were congressional hearings on Night Trap, right? Like we had people in Congress talking about, was Night Trap a game about raping women? Yep. And you're like, what? Like
Grand Theft Auto comes up so often because of how you can treat people in that game. So.
But like there actually is stuff in Grand Theft Auto you can do versus Night Trap, where it was like none of what you're talking about is actually in this game. Like you're just making up stuff like because you don't like that there are like, you know, real live actors on the screen and kids are interacting with them. And I feel like this is kind of this way, right? Like this is the sort of story you could see, let's say certain media outlets taking and running with and like blowing completely out of proportion. Like I'm reminded of Mass Effect and the like fact that you could have like gay characters in Mass Effect and how people got really mad about that because there was a sex scene, right, with the characters, and like it was all over like media, and people were like, oh my God, this is pornography. And you're like, you're watching it and you're like, what's pornographic in this? Like, you're not seeing anything. Like, this is what kids can see at 7:00 at night on broadcast television. Like, I mean, it wasn't like it was hardcore pornography in the middle of Mass Effect. So I think that's a valid concern to have. I mean, and it's weird because how do you balance that, right? Like, how do you balance the academic research that we all do with that being exploited by bad actors, right? Like, people who intend to use that to manipulate people who are less knowledgeable
For sure.
about what's going on. All right, that does it for news. So let's move on to our big question. And so yesterday was Leap Day. Anybody watch Leap Dave Williams?
No.
No.
30 Rock has an episode about Leap Day. It all takes place on Leap Day, and in it there is there's Leap Day Williams, which is this like sort of like Santa Claus like figure, Easter Bunny like figure. And then they made a movie called Leap Dave Williams within 30 Rock. And they got Jim Carrey and like Mary Steenburgen to like play in the movie. Oh, no. And so like they're, like there's little clips within the show where they like cut to this, and it's so perfectly done because it just looks like a Jim Carrey movie. Like it is like playing off a like Liar Liar.
Yeah.
And it just has that feeling. Like obviously Jim Carrey is in on the joke that it's making fun of him.
Yeah.
Like to a degree. And so like now whenever it's Leap Day, I like asking people, I'm like, hey, did you watch Leap Dave Williams? Because one of the things in the movie is that USA Network shows Leap Dave Williams for 24 hours straight to celebrate Leap Day every 4 years, which is just like fantastic. Like it's such great satire. It's like so on spot. But anyways, yesterday was Leap Day. So the question for this week is, which franchise would you like to see a new entry in consistently every 4 years? So part of the idea behind this was there are those franchises that we get every year, which is maybe too much. So like your Maddens and Call of Duties, and maybe they would be better if they took 4 years to develop the next one. And then there are those franchises that you just wish were more consistent, that, you sporadically get a new entry, a new sequel into those. And so maybe you would like to see those games more consistently get a new entry. So Mario, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so when I first read it, I definitely took it in that second interpretation of games that we don't get enough of. And my answer would be Metroid. Dread is the most recent new Metroid, and it was the first new Metroid in 11 years. The Samus Returns had come out since then, and I guess like Federation Force, which was the spinoff, had come out in that 11-year span as well.
But mainline Metroid games,
mainline
not
Metroid
remakes.
For me, it's really the 2D Metroids. I've never really got into the primes. I played the first one for a very little bit. I have 1 and 3, like on the GameCube and on the Wii, that I've just never really gotten around to. I would like to. I mean, I know Prime 1 is considered to be like one of the best games of all time. So I'd like to get around to them, but I would be genuinely happy if just every 4 years they put out a 2D Metroid game.
That's a really great answer. I 100% agree.
Well, that's the answer. So,
Also, like if you're gonna play Metroid Prime, play that Switch.
Play the new one.
Yeah, that Switch remake that they did. That's fantastic. Like,
yeah, I know you spoke very highly of it.
It fixes a lot of the control issues and stuff with the original. I think the controls of that original game are difficult to go back to, the GameCube version now.
If I remember you correctly, you talked about it mostly from like the dual stick aspect of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It plays like a first-person shooter in a way that original doesn't, for obvious reasons.
Yeah. But yeah, that would be my answer. Would be Metroid.
All right, good. Christina, how about you?
This is kind of rough because like most of the games I play are live service, and so they're constantly updating. So my answer would be things like I was gonna say like Isaac, because that's a game that it's cool to see the updates for, but the developer is like, this is the last one. I'm done with this project. I'm moving somewhere else, which I get. The only other game that I can think of that I play that kind of does this regularly, I wish it was more consistent, is Division. The Division.
Oh, yeah.
And I know they have something coming up because I am definitely a demographic that is abnormal for playing that game, and so I get asked a lot to check out things that I'm not legally allowed to talk about, like NDAs and stuff like that. But yeah, I guess that I wish they were a little more consistent with it. Maybe, I don't know. I don't play a lot of these games.
I think we're going to have to harass you for more information on a future podcast.
When I'm not being recorded.
Sources told us.
It's me and a sword. But yeah, that's probably my answer. The Division.
Yeah, and it felt like for a while we were getting a new division fairly consistently with those first two, and then there was the news of, what was it, Heartland was the new one, and then like I don't know the story of everything that happened there, but obviously I think their schedule got thrown off.
It did.
Yeah.
It was cool though that at least with Division 2 there was a lot of like updates to the story. But even those particular updates got a little repetitious in a way that, like, it was the same stories being replicated and there was nothing new. So it's like they were trying to, I don't know, say, I'm sorry that our Heartlands game is taking forever. Here is more baddies to go shoot at, I guess. I don't know. I'm just really looking forward to the next iteration of it.
All right. Kevin.
I also said Metroid, but a 3D. I want a 3D Metroid every 4 years. And you're right, the Switch version of Prime, that's the superior version. That's the one to play. It's really well done.
Yeah.
Or a Demon's Souls. I'm talking OG, like, slow, methodical pacing. Not as flashy and fast-paced as all these new Souls.
You really think about this as like an art form.
Yeah, I do.
I love that.
So yeah, old Demon Souls every 4 years, and I don't even need it to be like nothing fancy. Just Demon Souls 2, and then 3, and then 4. Just keep them coming like that, and I would be happy.
All right. All right. So I've thought of a few different answers for this. One I actually came up with when I wasn't thinking about Alicia not being here, and I was like, it would be good if, like, they waited every 4 years and made a new Sonic game because it could actually be good then.
Sorry, Alicia.
I mean, look, Sonic Mania was good. They could make a new one of those, and instead they went off and did their own thing. But I guess the two answers I would actually go with here are F-Zero. And because I've loved every F-Zero game that they have done, and I guess they gave us F-Zero 99 last year, which was really cool.
Before then, it's GX on the GameCube or something like that?
Yeah, GX, because it was AX was the arcade one that they did, and then F-Zero X for the Nintendo 64. Yeah, so I mean, they have fairly consistently skipped entire console generations. And it just feels like that's one of those properties, Nintendo, it makes sense to bring this back. Like, you have the power now with modern consoles to more kind of achieve what I think their vision of that franchise has always been. Even when they were doing the Nintendo 64 version, F-Zero X, that game ran at 60 frames a second on the Nintendo 64, and so it conveys that sense of speed.
Yeah, it was incredible.
That in a way that a lot of racing games don't, right? And so I would love to just see them consistently come back to that franchise in the way that they do Mario Kart, right? Like I love Mario Kart, but it's a very different style of racing game.
For sure.
And the other answer was NBA Jam. This is one of those I really don't understand why. Like, I think Electronic Arts owns the rights to NBA Jam now. Why not every 4 years put out a new NBA Jam with like a roster update, right? And
So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I feel like especially now, like as the NBA is probably the biggest it's ever been in terms of like popularity.
Probably.
And just think of like the star power that certain players have as compared to like, I mean, obviously like Jordan and Bird and all those guys, but like, I don't know if like at their peak, or at least in the 90s, were as popular as like LeBron or Steph Curry or those kinds of guys are.
Oh, Jordan was.
Yeah.
But like, yeah.
The
but
rest of the NBA, you're probably
there's
right.
a range. Like you've got like 15 to 25 different.
Basically, just the cast of Space Jam.
Sure.
That was it.
Right.
But yeah, you've got like this range of like star power that it, and you know, of different types of players as well.
Yeah, and I think the thing that always gets me is I talk to so many people who will tell me that, you know, when they know I'm really into video games, they're like, yeah, I used to really be into sports games like Tecmo Bowl and NBA Jam. And they're like, oh, these modern sports games are just too complicated for me.
They're the same.
And well, like, I understand it, right? Like playing a modern Madden game versus Tecmo Bowl is like one of those you can pick up and learn to play in 5 minutes. One of them is actually pretty complicated. Like you're, you know, managing 20 buttons on the face of a controller at the same time. And like NBA Jam was this really simple arcade game that anyone could pick up and play. So like if I have friends over and let's play a game, it would be cool. Like NBA 2K is probably, if they're not a regular game player, is probably a little more complicated than they're looking for. Whereas the NBA Jam games or the NBA Street games were really simple to pick up and play and get into. And there's not really that arcade sports style of game anymore, you know, blitz, and when it comes to football, and blades of steel, you know, for hockey.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, obviously they did 3 NFL Streets, and then they did NFL Tour, which was like street-esque, but those are still got to be at least over a decade, if not 15 years old, the most recent one. And I couldn't tell you when NBA Street 3 came out. Same thing as a long time ago.
It was a GameCube game.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that tells you something right there. It's 3 console generations ago.
I know they did the Ballers games as well, but
Right.
I think those are PS2, PS3 maybe, but I think those are also more story based.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I know we've talked about the street games a lot just because those are the ones I grew up playing, and yeah, would love to see some sort of return to something like that.
So arcade racers and arcade sports games, that's my answer, because those don't exist very much anymore. And it would be cool to see, you know, you don't need an NBA Jam every year, but if you put one out every 4 years, I think that would satiate that audience.
Did you try out Tape to Tape, the hockey roguelike?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah. I played a little bit of it, but I think I played a little bit of it when it was in early access still. And so it was like, oh, this is interesting. I'll pick this up and play it later when it's like, you know, 1.0 or whatever, fully released. But yeah, I mean, that game is very much trying to capture that NHL 94 style of gameplay, right? Like, so yeah, even something like NHL 94, right? We don't think of that as an arcade game, but like it very much has a much more arcade approach to that people can relate to.
And I think in terms of like, yes, they're a lot simpler. I also just appreciate like the goofiness of them.
Yeah.
Like they don't take themselves too seriously. Whereas I feel like with a Madden or a 2K, there's like understanding like offensive or defensive like schemes and strategies. And it's like, I don't need to know everything about like football to play a game. I just want to pass the ball or run the ball and, you know, blitz every play.
Right. Yeah. Blitz had like all of those wacky, like you could burst into
On
flames
fire and yeah.
Right.
all of those codes for like big heads or tiny
Yep.
heads and things like that. I mean, that was certainly fun, right? And very arcadey.
Yeah, in NBA Jam, you could play as Bill Clinton.
We need an NBA Space Jam game. Arcade 2D Space Jam game. Is there one? There isn't one, is there?
They
I know
for
of.
when Space Jam 2 came out, they put out some game, some Space Jam game, but it was like a free to play game. It was like an advertorial sort of game, right? Like, but yeah, there hasn't been like a full Space Jam game.
Which is kind of surprising that like at that era of games, the SNES didn't get a license.
Well, there was one on the PlayStation.
Toon Squad versus
Is that-
the
Right.
Monstars.
It seems like an
that's
easy
what I
grab,
thought.
you know?
That's what I
Maybe
thought.
there
There
was.
was one. There was one on the PlayStation
Oh, okay.
that looked very NBA Jam arcade-esque.
Well, the image you're showing right there, that's exactly what I was picturing. I thought
Yeah.
I was creating something just then. Something just magnificent on the fly.
I was
but
about to, like, as soon as you
deep
said it, I was
memory.
like, oh, wait, I think I've played this. Because, of course, I had to be Lola. Like,
But I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? Like, make an arcade style game using, your Looney Tunes or maybe Disney characters with real NBA stars as a way to co-market. But then you're also like helping to bring in that next generation of NBA fans, right? Because you have the kids who are going to play the game because they like Looney Tunes characters, right? And then they're going to learn who Steph Curry and LeBron James, who are people they may know, but like maybe the second tier of NBA star,
Sure.
right? Like
yeah.
might be the sort of person that they don't know who that is. Because like I remember as a kid playing Tecmo Bowl, right? And I knew who Bo Jackson was, but I didn't know who most of the other players were. And then I remember a lot of those games teaching me the rules
Oh, sure.
of sports when I was playing them because they were simple to pick up and play, but they did actually have the rules in there. So, I mean, you were learning, and they're the NES baseball games, of course, had Japanese rules. So, like, the game would get called if you got 10 runs ahead, which was very confusing as a kid. Like, well, this is not how baseball actually works, not in the U.S. at least. But like, I mean, I feel like those games are a good stepping on point, right?
And I think the other in the same vein were the backyard sports games. I don't know if that's
Sure.
sort of
Backyard football and things.
Yeah, at whatever iteration of sport those kids were playing, I had it. So yeah, no, I think that's a great answer.
Have you ever played Jerry Rice's Nidus football?
No.
Oh, no.
So it's Jerry Rice and his dog, and
It's on the Wii.
it may be on the Wii.
Okay.
It's on the PC, I know. And you are like, so you would appreciate this. You're like in San Francisco, like playing,
Okay.
and so like you're in San Francisco Park, like, and you're like throwing the football, and the dog is catching it and running with it, and then
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the exact picture I've seen of it on the Wii. So that's funny.
so it's on Steam.
Okay.
Because I own it on Steam. and that game's amazing. Like, it's such a bizarre game. And I don't think it's a particularly great game, but like it's the sort of like goofy thing that
Is you
like,
running from a cow? Is like in the game?
yeah, that sounds right.
Oh, no.
But like that's the sort of like game. Like, I mean, I wish they made more games like that.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I suppose there's a financial reason they don't make those sorts of games anymore, but I do feel like there's an audience there who would, because there's so many people I know who are casual game players, right? Like, we talk about them all the time. These are the people who they buy 2 games a year, right? And Call of Duty is one of them. And then they're buying one other thing that they're going to play that year. And I feel like that's the audience that those sorts of sports games used to appeal to.
Yeah. Well, and I forget the other example I was going to give. Oh, so I think I mentioned it a few weeks ago. For the N64 group, we played Blitz Special Edition for the Super Bowl. And, we were talking about it. And the other one that, I don't even know if the Arena Football League still exists, but like stuff like that, like the secondary leagues seem like they would be the perfect thing for those types of goofy games as well. If like, one, you get to promote your league, but 2, do something weird with it. Add the walls were like supposed to be the weird thing that like Arena Football added, or, even something like
They made an Arena Football.
they did for the PlayStation.
And it's like using the Blitz engine, I believe. Yeah.
That was part of our conversation when we were playing Blitz. Or even just like, I don't know if you can do, the ways that like individual players sort of got connected to games, like a Bill Lambier combat basketball type of thing.
Right.
Where like, I don't know if you could, if an individual player could sort of like sell their likeness like that for a specific game, at least one that's currently in the league. But yeah, I don't know. Those types of games are silly and weird and fun.
Yeah. Well, we are going very long on time, so we should probably end the podcast now. But we've had lots of great conversation. So thank you to Mario and Christina and Kevin for joining me. Thank you for those of you listening at home or wherever you may be. You can always email us if you have questions or comments at justin.young@siu.edu. You can also check out past episodes and our Game of the Year list and everything for 2023 at salukigames.com. And we will be back next week with another episode. Until then, go outside and play some football with your dog.